The cathedral doors are closed. Inside, 500 of Seoul's most powerful people are holding their breath, because in just 4 seconds, those doors are going to be torn off their hinges by a man everyone in this city believed was dead. Myeongdong Cathedral glows gold under 100 candles. Cameras mounted along the marble columns broadcast the ceremony live to screens in the lobby, in the courtyard, in boardrooms across the city, because when the Han Group marries into money, the whole country watches. Amara Balogun stands at the altar in white lace, her spine straight, her face a mask of composure that costs her everything to hold. Beside her, Min Han straightens his cufflinks and mutters to the priest to move things along, as if his own wedding is an inconvenience standing between him and something more important. The priest lifts his hands. If anyone knows of any lawful impediment why this couple should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. Silence swallows the cathedral. Somewhere in the third pew, Kofi Balogun, the bride's father, shifts in his seat, his hand resting on the brass key he still, out of habit, carries clipped to his belt. Then the 10-foot oak doors explode inward. 3 men in black tactical gear, Min Soo Jun and Jae-won, Sora's personal security detail, move down the aisle first, fast, silent, professional. Gasps ripple through the pews. And behind them, walking like a man who has waited 2 years for this exact moment, is Sora Kang, with only the faintest stiffness in his left leg, the kind most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. Amara's bouquet slips from her fingers and hits the marble floor. "I object," Sora says, and his voice carries to every corner of the cathedral without him raising it at all. Before anyone can react, Kofi Balogun stands, steps into the aisle, and lifts one hand toward the billionaire who just kicked down the doors of the most expensive wedding in the country. "Young man," Kofi says, utterly serious, "where is your visitor badge?" To understand how a dead man just walked into his ex-fiancée's wedding, we have to go back 24 months earlier. Seoul in winter is not gentle. Amara Balogun had come from Lagos 3 years before with a scholarship, a suitcase, and a stubborn refusal to be intimidated by a city that made it clear, in 1,000 small ways, that she did not belong in its glass towers. She worked days at a logistics startup crammed into 2 floors of a converted warehouse in Hongdae, and most nights she stayed late, because staying late was the only way anyone noticed her work instead of her accent. Sora Kang noticed anyway. He was 2 years into building what would eventually become one of Asia's most disruptive logistics tech companies, a billion-dollar regional powerhouse. He would grow from a cramped, rented office into an empire, though none of that had happened yet. Within a few years, the company would make Sora Kang one of Asia's youngest self-made billionaires. Unlike the Han family, he had no fortune to inherit and no name to fall back on. Every one he would ever have would be earned through sleepless nights, brutal negotiations, and an almost unreasonable refusal to fail. For now, he still answered his own phone, still ate instant noodles at his desk, still forgot what day it was more often than not. He wasn't from money. He'd clawed his way up from a small apartment in Incheon, and something about watching Amara argue a supply chain algorithm into submission at 11 at night made him feel, for the first time in a long time, like he wasn't the only person in Seoul running on stubbornness alone. Their first real conversation happened on the office rooftop. In the middle of a snowfall neither of them had the sense to go inside for. Amara was there because the server room was too hot and her head needed the cold. Sora was there because he always was. "You're going to freeze," she told him. "So will you," he said, "but neither of us is leaving." They laughed, and something in that laugh cracked open a door neither of them expected. Over the following months, that rooftop became theirs. Cheap coffee in paper cups, arguments about shipping routes that somehow turned into arguments about home, about family, about what it meant to build something from nothing in a city that didn't want you to succeed. It was on that rooftop, on a night when Amara admitted, quietly, that she was terrified of losing everyone she loved to distance and silence, that Sora took her wrist and tapped it 3 times, slow and deliberate. "What was that?" she asked. "A promise," he said. 3 taps. It means check the locks. Make sure everything's secure. Make sure you're real, and I'm real, and none of this disappears in the morning. He tapped her wrist again. "Whenever you need to know I'm still here, you do this, and I'll answer." She laughed at first, called it the strangest declaration of affection she'd ever received. But that night, walking home through the snow, She found herself tapping her own wrist just to see if it still felt like a promise. It did. One evening, not long after, walking home through Hongdae, they passed a tiny jewelry shop wedged between a noodle stand and a laundromat, its window lit with a single raw emerald ring on a velvet cushion. Amara stopped. "It's beautiful," she said. "Too expensive," Sora said, already pulling her along by the hand. She laughed. "Good. Then you'll remember it." He looked back at the window once before they turned the corner and said nothing at all, though the ring stayed with him longer than either of them realized. 24 months before the wedding that would consume the city's attention, Sora discovered something that would end the life he'd built for himself. Buried inside shipping manifests his company had acquired through a routine merger, he found a pattern hundreds of millions of won moving through Macau shell companies, disguised as freight costs for cargo that never existed. It took him 3 sleepless weeks to trace the pattern back to its source, Han Group. Min Han's signature was on half of it. He should have gone to the authorities immediately. Instead, driven by the same stubbornness that built his company, he flew to Macau himself, determined to acquire the small logistics firm that held the physical shipping ledger's hard evidence that couldn't be deleted with a keystroke. He never told Amara where he was going. He told himself it was to protect her. He would come to regret that decision more than any other in his life. The night he left the Macau garage with a copy of the ledgers in his bag, his car's brakes failed on a coastal road outside the city. The vehicle went through a guardrail and into a ravine, and by the time anyone reached the wreckage, it was already engulfed in flame. Somewhere in Seoul, Min Han received a phone call confirming the job was done and allowed himself, for the first time in months, to sleep well. But Sora Kang did not die that night. He was thrown clear of the wreck before the fire took hold, badly broken, barely conscious, and found hours later by a fisherman on his way to the harbor. What followed were months of surgeries, of relearning how to walk, of hiding in a rehabilitation facility under a name that wasn't his, because the moment he woke enough to understand what had happened, he understood something else too. Whoever had ordered the hit still believed he was dead, and the safest thing he could do for the woman he loved was to let them keep believing it. The first thing Sora wanted to do, the moment he was lucid enough to understand where he was call Amara. The second thing he learned, days later, was that he couldn't. His legal team, quietly investigating the crash on his behalf, discovered that whoever had ordered the hit still had access to his old phone records, his company's servers, and more chillingly, the security systems around Amara's apartment building. If he called her, the call could be traced. If Han Group learned she knew he was alive, she would become the next loose end in a story someone had already tried to bury once. So Sora made the decision that would break him more completely than the crash ever had. He would let Amara believe he was dead, and he would make the people responsible believe it too. He started building, in secret, the case that would one day set both of them free. Amara never knew that for the first 6 months after Sora's death, a black sedan appeared outside her apartment building almost every evening, parked just close enough to see her window. She assumed, when she noticed it at all, that it belonged to a neighbor. Sora's investigators would later discover otherwise. Someone had been watching her, waiting to see if grief made her careless, if she reached out to anyone who might lead them to loose ends they hadn't yet tied off. She never felt eyes on her. She only felt, without being able to name it, that Seoul had grown colder. Back in Seoul, Amara had no such clarity. All she had was grief, and a father who watched his daughter disappear into herself a little more with every passing week. Kofi Balogun had worked as a night gatekeeper his whole career, first in Lagos, then in Seoul, standing watch over gates that belonged to men wealthier than he could imagine. Without Sora, the company lost its investors, its leadership, and several major contracts that had depended on him personally. Within months, what had looked unstoppable collapsed into bankruptcy. As the small savings the Balogun family had built began to run dry, Kofi did what he had always done. He found another gate to watch. This time, it belonged to the Han Group estate. He never imagined that gate would change everything. 3 months into the job, on a night thick with rain, a group of armed men attempted to breach the estate's private residence, a targeted attack meant to look like a robbery, though its true purpose would only become clear much later. Kofi Balogun, unarmed, 61 years old, tackled the lead intruder to the ground and took a bullet graze across his shoulder, protecting a man he barely knew, Chairman Han himself. The chairman never forgot it. Within a week, Kofi was promoted to security director. Within a year, Chairman Han had given him a seat on the board and transferred 20% of a newly created security subsidiary into his name, a gesture the chairman called gratitude, and Kofi quietly understood was also insurance. He kept the brass key from his gatekeeper days clipped to his belt anyway, a habit no one at Han Group quite understood, though it would come to mean something to all of them eventually. Grateful, but disgusted by his own son's reckless spending and instability, Chairman Han made a decision he believed was an act of discipline. He froze Min's personal accounts entirely and wrote a new clause into the family trust. Min would receive no access to the Han family fortune unless he married a woman of good character who might finally steady him, and even then, the trust required him to remain married for at least 1 year before the full inheritance became accessible. It wasn't enough to say his vows. He had to stay married for the money to ever reach his hands. That single detail was why Min wasn't simply marrying Amara to satisfy his father. He needed the marriage, needed it to hold, because she had become the key to unlocking billions he could not survive without. He looked at Kofi's daughter, dignified, brilliant, grieving, and decided she was exactly what his son needed. He knew, in a distant way, that she had once been engaged to a young entrepreneur who died in an accident abroad. Everyone in Seoul's business circles knew that story. He never imagined the connection ran any deeper than tragic coincidence, never imagined his own son's hands were on it. To him, her grief only proved she understood loss, and might finally understand how to steady a man who didn't. By the time Min proposed, nearly 18 months had passed since Sora's supposed death. They had been engaged for 6 months. Amara said yes, for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Her father's safety, her family's future, the debts that had piled up since Sora's death. She told herself it was a transaction, nothing more, and that she could survive 2 years of anything if it meant her family never went hungry again. She had no idea the man asking for her hand had ordered the death of the man she still loved. The engagement announcement made headlines across the country. Reporters called it a fairy tale, the security director's daughter marrying into one of Korea's most powerful families. No one printed the truth, that behind closed doors, Min Han was a man teetering on the edge of desperation, one frozen bank account away from losing everything he believed he was owed. He courted Amara the only way he knew how, with money. Flowers flown in from Amsterdam, a ring that could have paid for a small apartment building. He mistook her calm composure for affection, never once recognizing it for what it actually was, a woman learning, day by day, how to survive in a house built on lies. Min had one genuinely impressive talent. He could turn an ordinary inconvenience into a luxury emergency. When Amara mentioned once, almost absently, that she missed the taste of proper Nigerian food, he didn't ask her where to find it. He rented an entire restaurant for the evening and flew in a chef from Lagos to cook it. "You could have just bought me dinner," she told him, half amused despite herself. "That would have been ordinary," he said. "Sometimes ordinary is good." He smiled, and for a moment it looked almost real. "Then I'll learn ordinary," she almost laughed. And that was the dangerous part. Every once in a while, beneath the arrogance and the extravagance, she caught a glimpse of the man he might have become if anyone had ever taught him that love wasn't something you could purchase in bulk. It made him harder to hate cleanly and easier to underestimate. At company events, he would rest a hand at the small of her back a beat too long, watch her face for a flinch she never gave him the satisfaction of showing. "You'll grow to like all this," he told her once, gesturing at the marble and glass of the Han penthouse. "Everyone does, eventually." Amara smiled the smile she'd perfected for exactly these moments. "I'm sure I will," she said, and excused herself to the balcony, where she could breathe. It was on one of those balcony retreats months into the engagement that she noticed something strange. Min kept a small wall safe in his private study, and every time he opened it, he used the same 4-digit code without looking at the keypad. She'd watched him do it twice from across the room, half by accident, and something about his carelessness, the arrogance of a man who never imagined anyone would dare look closer, lodged itself in her mind. The code wasn't random, she realized. It was the date he believed marked the beginning of his destiny, the day his father had publicly named him heir, the day he talked about more than any other because, in his own words, "That's the day everyone finally saw what I was capable of." He'd chosen it precisely because his ego made it feel unguessable. She tried it on the safe one quiet Tuesday afternoon while he was in a meeting. It worked on the first attempt. Inside, beneath a stack of documents about nothing in particular, she found an encrypted USB drive. It took her 2 more weeks and a great deal of careful, quiet research to access what was on it. Wire transfer records, dates, amounts, a reference code that pointed to a name she didn't recognize yet, a fixer operating out of Macau. Something about the reference code nagged at her, and one sleepless night she pulled up an old shipping manifest from her own logistics work and found a matching code buried in a freight cost line item. The money hadn't just been laundered through shell companies. It had been used to move cargo that was never declared, never inspected, never meant to exist on paper at all. Whatever Min was involved in, it was bigger and uglier than a single bad account. She didn't know what it meant, not fully, but she understood enough to know it was dangerous, and that the man she was engaged to was not simply reckless. He was hiding something that could destroy him. She copied the drive, hid the original exactly where she'd found it, and began, in secret, to build a case of her own, not knowing that thousands of kilometers away, the man she thought she'd lost 2 years ago was building the exact same case against the exact same enemy. While Amara worked in silence, Min's world was quietly collapsing. The Macau garage where his fixer had tampered with Sora's brakes had been wiped clean at Min's order, every server erased, every camera feed destroyed. But a former systems administrator, a nervous, underpaid man, who had quietly kept an offline backup drive as insurance against exactly this kind of employer, resurfaced 6 months before the wedding with a demand. $5 million, or the footage went straight to financial crimes prosecutors. Min had no way to pay it. His father's freeze had seen to his personal accounts, and the offshore account still holding the Macau laundering proceeds was untouchable in its own way. The money in it was evidence, tracked and flagged, and moving so much as a one of it would trigger the exact alarms he was trying to avoid. The only asset large enough, fast enough, and clean enough to save him was the trust fund locked behind his marriage to Amara Balogun. The wedding had originally been scheduled for 3 months later. Min moved it forward, leaving only 3 weeks before the ceremony. He stopped pretending to be charming and started simply demanding. "We're getting married in 3 weeks, he told Amara over dinner. Not a question. "Any particular reason for the rush?" she asked, watching him carefully. "Does it matter?" He didn't meet her eyes. "The sooner it's done, the sooner we can stop pretending this is complicated." She said nothing. But that night, she copied every file on the USB drive a second time and hid the backup somewhere. Even Min's most paranoid security sweep would never find it sewn into the lining of her wedding dress. 2,000 kilometers away, in a private hospital wing registered under a false name, Sora Kang finally received the confirmation he'd been waiting 2 years for. His legal team had quietly acquired controlling interest in the parent company that owned the Macau garage, giving them legitimate access to archived security systems. No one had thought to search because no one knew Sora Kang was alive to look. The footage was there. Grainy, damning, undeniable. A man matching the description of Min's known fixer, tampering with the brake lines of a car Sora had rented under an assumed name that night 2 years ago. His lawyer studied the recovered footage for a long moment, then made a single phone call. "We have the chain of custody?" she asked. "Complete," the voice on the other end said. "And financial crimes? They'll be waiting." Sora looked toward the window, toward a city that had spent 2 years believing him dead. "Then we're done hiding," he said. Sora sat alone in a dim hospital room, staring at a photograph he still carried, a photograph of a rooftop in Hongdae and snow falling on a woman he had promised to always come back to. He picked up his phone and, for the first time in 2 years, allowed himself to make a call that wasn't about surveillance, evidence, or protection. He called the one man he trusted completely, a former Han Group employee who had quietly fed him information for over a year. "Tell me she's still okay?" Sora said. "She's engaged to him," the man answered. "Wedding's in 3 weeks." Sora closed his eyes. 2 years of careful, controlled patience nearly broke in that single moment. "Then we move now," he said, before she says yes to a lie. The 3 weeks that followed moved like a held breath. Zola, Amara's closest friend and reluctant maid of honor, threw herself into wedding preparations with a chaotic energy that masked how little she trusted the groom. She referred to the entire event, loudly and often, as the corporate merger, much to the horror of the wedding planner. When Min's imported roses arrived, flown in at absurd expense from Amsterdam, Zola calmly replaced them with cheap white lilies from the corner market and blamed a supplier error. When Min stood too close to Amara at a fitting, Zola accidentally tipped a full cup of hibiscus tea across the toe of his $6,000 shoes. "Oops," she said, not sounding remotely sorry. "Corporate mergers are so messy." It was the only lightness in weeks that otherwise felt like walking toward a cliff. 1 hour before the ceremony, alone in the cathedral's dressing room, Amara sat in her wedding dress with a copied USB drive hidden in her lace sleeve and allowed herself, for the first time in 2 years, to fully feel the weight of everything she had lost and everything she was about to do. She lifted her own wrist and tapped it 3 times, slow, deliberate, the way he'd taught her on a rooftop in the snow. "Check the locks," she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking on the last word. "I need you to be real. I need this to still mean something." No one answered. She hadn't expected anyone to. She wiped her eyes, straightened her spine, and walked toward the doors, ready to marry a man she despised in order to protect the family she loved, carrying evidence against him sewn into her own dress like a quiet act of war. Sora wasn't walking into that cathedral to intimidate anyone. He was walking into the most dangerous room in Seoul, fully aware that the man who had once tried to have him killed might still have people willing to finish the job. Min Soo, June, and Jae-won weren't there for show. They were there because Sora intended to leave that cathedral alive. She had no idea that, only minutes away, a convoy of 3 black vehicles was already moving through Seoul traffic toward her, carrying a man she believed had died 2 years ago, and enough evidence to end the life Min Han had built on lies. Which brings us back to the moment the doors exploded open. Kofi Balogun stood in the aisle, hand raised, demanding a visitor badge from the man who had just crashed his daughter's wedding with 3 armed guards. And then recognition hit him like a physical blow. He lowered his hand slowly. His eyes went wide, then wet. "To Sora?" Sora nodded once, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. Kofi's face broke into something between a laugh and a sob. He stepped aside, clapped a hand on the younger man's shoulder as he passed. "Perimeter's clear, son," he murmured, the old gatekeeper's phrase slipping out of him like a blessing. Behind Sora, the same 3-man security detail, a trio so synchronized in movement that years of training seemed to have turned them into a single unit, all reached for their earpieces at the exact same instant, responding to a command none of the wedding guests had heard given. Kofi watched them, momentarily distracted even in the chaos. "Do you boys practice that?" All 3 stared back at him, silent, identical, unreadable. "Right," Kofi said. "Never mind." At the altar, Min's composure cracked for the first time in months. "This is impossible," he said, his voice climbing toward panic. "You're dead. I watched the report. You're supposed to be dead." "I was supposed to be a lot of things," Sora said, walking down the aisle with a calm that was more terrifying than rage would have been. "Dead was the one I let you believe." He didn't rush toward Amara. He didn't demand anything. Instead, he reached into his jacket and produced a sealed evidence drive, placing it deliberately on the altar between the bride and groom, as if setting down the final piece of a puzzle 2 years in the making. While Sora had spent 2 years quietly gathering the evidence, his legal team had spent the final weeks securing the warrants that would allow authorities to act the moment the forensic chain of custody was complete. That moment was now. A man in a plain dark suit, who had slipped among the guests 20 minutes earlier posing as a photographer's assistant, stepped forward and identified himself quietly as a forensic investigator from Seoul Financial Crimes, already in position and waiting for Sora's signal. He connected the drive to the cathedral's professional livestream terminal, the same system that had been broadcasting Min and Amara's wedding to screens across the city only minutes before. He spoke into a small radio clipped to his collar. "Confirmed. File hash matches the forensic copy recovered from the Macau server. Play it." The massive screens mounted along the cathedral's columns, the same screens that had shown the bride walking down the aisle in white lace, now filled with grainy security footage. A coastal road, a parked car, a man working beneath it with tools that had nothing to do with routine maintenance. The same live stream that had been built to broadcast Min Han's wedding as a celebration of his family's power was now carrying the evidence of his crimes to screens across the entire country. Every guest in that cathedral, every camera still broadcasting live, watched the moment Min Han's hired man sabotaged the brakes that were meant to kill Sora Kang. Min stared at the screen as if the floor had opened beneath him. His mouth moved without sound for several seconds before anything came out. He turned to Amara, and for the first time in 2 years of careful performance, real fear entered his voice. You knew?" he asked her. "How long have you known?" Amara stepped forward, and the calm on her face was colder and more devastating than any scream could have been. "Long enough to realize that every time you told me you loved me, you were standing on top of a grave you dug yourself," she said. She reached into the lace sleeve of her wedding dress and drew out the copied USB drive she had hidden there that morning, dropping it onto the altar beside the one Sora had brought. "Here are the wire transfers from the offshore account you controlled. Dates, amounts, a reference code matching the fixer in that footage. I found it 4 months ago, in your own safe, using the code you never bothered to hide." Something in Min's expression shattered completely in that moment, not from grief or guilt, but from the specific horror of a man realizing the woman he believed he controlled had been quietly building the case that would destroy him, inside his own house, under his own roof. For months, he didn't apologize. He didn't have it in him to admit what he'd done. "You used me," he said instead, as if that were the crime. "No," Amara said quietly. "I didn't survive you by becoming like you. I survived you. There's a difference." Seoul financial crimes officers moved down the aisle before Min could say anything else, warrant already in hand, the wedding's private security standing aside without resistance once they understood what was happening. Min fought them for exactly 3 seconds, thrashing against the arm of an officer who, in the chaos, accidentally planted a boot squarely on the trailing hem of his $3,000 suit trousers. "You're being detained on charges of fraud, attempted murder, and money laundering," the officer said, reading from memory as he secured the cuffs. "Get your foot off my suit," Min shouted, red-faced, outraged, apparently more concerned with the fabric than the felonies. "I heard you. I'm talking about the suit." Somewhere in the pews, despite everything, a ripple of stunned, disbelieving laughter broke the tension, because some moments are too absurd not to. As officers led Min Han from the cathedral in handcuffs, past guests who had come to celebrate a wedding and were instead witnessing the public unraveling of one of Korea's most powerful families, Sora Kang climbed the marble steps toward the altar, toward Amara, slowly, as if he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to. She stood exactly where she had stood minutes before, still in white, still holding the composure that had carried her through 2 years of grief she'd never fully allowed herself to feel, and watched him approach with an expression that finally cracked open. "I didn't come to claim you, Amara," Sora said, stopping just short of her, his voice unsteady for the first time since he'd walked through those doors. "I didn't fight for 2 years to walk in here and tell you who to marry instead. I came to break the lock so you could finally choose. For yourself, even if that choice isn't me." Amara let out a sound that was half sob, half disbelieving laugh, the sound of 2 years of grief finally finding somewhere to go. She reached out with a trembling hand, wrapped it around his wrist, and tapped it 3 times, slow and deliberate, the way he'd taught her on a rooftop in the snow a lifetime ago. "Check the locks," she whispered, her voice breaking completely. "Tell me you're real, Sora. Tell me this isn't just what I wish for every night for 2 years. He gently closed his free hand over hers and tapped her wrist 3 times in return. "Always," he said. "I'm real. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere again." She broke then, fully, sobbing against his chest in front of 500 stunned wedding guests, and the camera still quietly broadcasting to screens across the city, and Sora held her the way he'd wanted to for 2 impossibly long years, one hand pressed against the back of her head, as if he could somehow make up for all the time silence had stolen from them. When she finally pulled back enough to look at him, he reached into his jacket one more time, not for evidence this time, but for a small velvet case. Inside sat a modest ring, nothing like the extravagant diamond Min had once presented with so much noise and so little meaning, a simple, raw emerald, the kind sold in a tiny shop they'd once wandered into together on a cold afternoon in Hongdae, back when neither of them had any money and all the time in the world. "I kept walking past that shop for 2 years, he admitted. "Told myself if I ever got the chance to come back to you, I wouldn't waste it on something that didn't mean anything." Amara looked at the ring, then at him, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, her tears were only happy ones. 6 months later, the offices of Kang Balogun Global Logistics occupied 2 floors of a converted warehouse in Hongdae, not far from the rooftop where it had all begun. Rather than revive the company that had quietly folded after the world believed him dead, Sora and Amara had chosen to build something entirely new, together from nothing the way they always said they would. Kofi Balogun, now a board director and shareholder several times over, still kept his old brass gatekeeper's key clipped to his belt every single day, a small, stubborn reminder of exactly where he'd started and exactly what it had cost him to rise. Chairman Han, watching his son sentenced to years behind bars for fraud, attempted murder, and money laundering, finally understood something that decades of wealth and discipline had never managed to teach him. Money could not build character where none existed. It could only reveal, eventually, what was already there. Amara and Sora married quietly, 3 months after that, in a small ceremony with no cameras and no live stream, just family, and Zola loudly informing the caterer that this, at least, was not a corporate merger. Kofi walked his daughter down the aisle himself, brass key still clipped to his belt, and when the officiant asked if anyone objected, Kofi simply smiled and said nothing at all. Because this time, there was nothing to object to. Not ownership, not obligation, just 2 people choosing each other again, on purpose, every single day. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who loves meaningful stories. We'll see you in our next unforgettable journey.